Life had never been easy for Daniel and Rebecca Carter, but like many middle-class couples, they had modest dreams and hoped for a better future. They lived in a small town in rural Texas, where Daniel worked as a mechanic and Rebecca was a primary school teacher. Money was always tight, and every month was a struggle to make ends meet. One ordinary Friday night, while grocery shopping, Daniel noticed a lottery advertisement with an $85 million jackpot. He had never been one to gamble, but for some reason, something made him buy a ticket that day. "What if luck is on our side?" he joked, while Rebecca rolled her eyes, calling him a dreamer. The next day, sitting on their worn-out couch, they turned on the TV to check the numbers, with no real expectations. One by one, the winning numbers were read aloud, and with each match, their breathing grew heavier. When the last number appeared on the screen, a heavy silence filled the room, followed by screams and tears of disbelief. They had just become millionaires. That night, Rebecca couldn't sleep, caught between euphoria and fear of what this meant. The following morning, they drove to the state lottery office to claim their prize, greeted by applause and flashing cameras. Their story quickly spread, and soon, they were being interviewed by newspapers and talk shows. The first thing they did was buy their dream home, a spacious mansion with a pool and a breathtaking lake view. Next, they helped family members, donated money to charity, and traveled to places they never imagined visiting. At first, everything felt like a fairy tale. The weight of financial struggles had vanished, and their lives finally made sense. Rebecca quit her job to enjoy their newfound freedom, while Daniel became obsessed with investments and business ventures. Old friends started showing up out of nowhere, some asking for favors, others offering once-in-a-lifetime opportunities. Excited about their new reality, the couple saw no reason to be suspicious. Their days were filled with lavish dinners, extravagant parties, and encounters with influential people. But amid the celebrations and newfound privileges, subtle tensions began to surface. Rebecca started noticing small changes in Daniel, who now spent hours fixated on new investments and seemed increasingly paranoid about those around them. He was no longer the same simple man who fixed engines and came home covered in grease. Rebecca, too, felt different. Financial freedom had brought her comfort, but at the same time, an unsettling sense of emptiness. The happiness they had longed for was finally there, yet something felt off, something they couldn't quite put into words. Still, they ignored their concerns and moved forward, believing everything was under control. But they were wrong. At first, Daniel and Rebecca told themselves that money wouldn't change them. They had seen enough cautionary tales of lottery winners who lost everything, and they were determined to be different. But as the weeks went by, subtle shifts in their personalities and habits became undeniable. Daniel, once a laid-back and hard-working man, started developing an obsession with wealth management. He spent hours reading about high-risk investments, cryptocurrency, and real estate, often staying up late at night researching opportunities. Rebecca, on the other hand, who had once found joy in teaching children, suddenly felt disconnected from her old life. She convinced herself that she deserved to enjoy this moment, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she no longer had a real purpose. Their spending habits also took a drastic turn. What started as a reasonable splurge, buying a bigger house, upgrading their cars, and taking a few luxury vacations, quickly spiraled into something else entirely. Daniel impulsively purchased a $3 million vacation home in Aspen without consulting Rebecca, reasoning that they needed a private retreat away from the world. Rebecca, in response, booked a shopping trip to Paris with her closest friend, spending more in a week than she had earned in an entire year as a teacher. The couple reassured themselves that they could afford it, that their wealth was practically endless. But what they hadn't accounted for was the constant pressure from those around them. Friends and distant relatives came out of nowhere, each with their own sob stories and business proposals. Some wanted loans, others wanted gifts, and a few even demanded financial help as if it were their right. At first, Daniel and Rebecca were generous, eager to share their good fortune. But the more they gave, the more people expected. When they started saying no, they noticed a change in how people treated them. Some old friends stopped calling altogether, while others became passive-aggressive, subtly implying that they had become selfish. The pressure didn't just come from friends and family. Strangers began contacting them too. Every day, they received dozens of emails, letters, and phone calls from people they had never met, begging for financial help. Some messages were heartfelt pleas from people in desperate situations. Others were disturbing, filled with threats and manipulation, claiming that they owed it to society to share their wealth. The stress of it all began to take a toll on their relationship. Daniel became distrustful of everyone, questioning whether people liked him for who he was or just for his money. He started hiring financial advisors, lawyers, and security consultants, trying to protect himself from scammers. Rebecca, on the other hand, felt increasingly isolated. She missed the simplicity of their old life. The days when she didn't have to wonder whether a friend's kindness was genuine or just another attempt to get something from them. Arguments between them became more frequent, small disagreements turning into heated fights. The dream they had wished for was starting to feel like a curse. Rebecca even joked once that maybe they were better off when they were struggling to pay rent. Daniel didn't laugh. He just stared at her, as if deep down he agreed but refused to admit it. They were still wealthy, still enjoying their riches, but an uncomfortable realization was settling in. The more money they had, the more they felt like they were losing control of their own lives. It started with little things, small, seemingly innocent incidents that neither Daniel nor Rebecca paid much attention to at first. A bank statement with an unexpected withdrawal, a misplaced contract for an investment Daniel swore he had signed, an odd phone call from an unknown number where the person on the other end remained silent for several seconds before hanging up. They brushed these off as accidents or clerical errors. But soon, these small anomalies began to multiply. Rebecca noticed that packages she hadn't ordered were arriving at their house, expensive items charged to her account. She assumed Daniel had purchased them, but when she confronted him, he was just as confused as she was. Meanwhile, Daniel began receiving strange emails from financial advisors he had never heard of, warning him about risky investments he hadn't made. Then came the letters. At first, they were nothing more than the usual flood of requests for money. Strangers begging for donations, distant relatives asking for financial favors. But soon, the letters took on a more sinister tone. One arrived without a return address, with nothing written inside except a single sentence: "You don't deserve this money." Another one came a week later, containing a grainy photograph of their mansion taken from outside their property. Someone was watching them. That night, Rebecca insisted on calling the police, but Daniel waved it off. "It's just some bitter idiot trying to scare us," he said. But deep down, he wasn't so sure. He started checking their security cameras obsessively, reviewing hours of footage every night. He even hired a private security team, insisting it was just a precaution. Rebecca hated it. She felt like they were prisoners in their own home. But Daniel reassured her that it was just paranoia, that they had nothing to worry about. Then, Daniel's accounts were hacked. One morning, he woke up to find that $500,000 had disappeared overnight. His financial team acted quickly, freezing all transactions and launching an internal investigation. But what worried Daniel most wasn't the stolen money. It was how easily someone had gained access to his accounts. Who else had access to their finances? Who could be trusted? The financial firm suggested an inside job, but Daniel refused to believe that anyone on his personal team would betray him. He started to doubt everyone: his lawyer, his accountant, even some of his closest friends. Rebecca, meanwhile, was growing increasingly anxious. She felt eyes on her everywhere she went: at the grocery store, at the gym, even in their own backyard. One evening, as she was walking to the car, she noticed a black SUV parked near their driveway, engine running, windows tinted. When she turned to get a closer look, the SUV sped off without a sound. She told Daniel about it, but he dismissed it, saying she was imagining things. But she knew what she saw. Someone was watching them. As their paranoia grew, so did their mistakes. Daniel pulled out of several investments, fearing they were traps, only to later discover that they had been perfectly sound. Rebecca cut off friendships that she suspected were manipulative, only to later regret it when she realized they had been genuine. They were both making enemies without even knowing who they were fighting against. The final straw came when Daniel discovered a large transfer of funds that neither he nor his team had authorized. $1 million gone. That's when he knew this wasn't just a series of coincidences. Someone was coming after them. That night, Daniel finally admitted that they had a problem. "We need help," he told Rebecca. "This is bigger than us." She had been waiting for him to say that. She had felt it in her gut for weeks. Something was happening behind the scenes, something deliberate, but they had no idea what or who was responsible. What they didn't realize was that by the time they finally understood the danger, it was already too late. The night Daniel admitted they needed help was the first time in weeks that he and Rebecca were completely honest with each other. No more pretending everything was fine. No more downplaying the strange occurrences. But by then, the damage had already been done. Their paranoia had taken root, and the cracks in their relationship were turning into fractures. Daniel barely slept anymore. He spent hours locked in his office, going over security footage, reviewing financial statements, and making frantic calls to private investigators. Rebecca, meanwhile, felt like a prisoner in their own home, jumping at every noise, every shadow, convinced that danger was lurking just outside their walls. And then came the message that changed everything. One evening, Daniel received a text from an unknown number. It was a single photo, Rebecca, sitting alone at a cafe that morning, looking at her phone. The message below read, "Do you really know who she's talking to?" His heart pounded as he stared at the screen. Who had taken this picture? Why were they sending it to him? But more importantly, what were they implying? Daniel's mind instantly went to the worst-case scenario. Was Rebecca hiding something from him? Had she been meeting with someone behind his back? He tried to dismiss the thought. This was exactly what whoever was behind this wanted, to make him doubt her. But the seed had been planted. That night, Daniel was colder than usual, distant and short-tempered. Rebecca noticed immediately. "What's wrong?" she asked. He hesitated before answering. "Nothing," he lied, but she could see it in his eyes. He didn't trust her, and that terrified her more than anything else. The tension between them reached a breaking point a few days later, when Rebecca went to use one of their joint bank accounts and discovered that it had been emptied. Furious, she confronted Daniel, who claimed he had moved the money to a safer account. "You didn't think to tell me," she snapped. But the truth was, he didn't tell her on purpose. He wasn't sure if he could. What if she was involved in whatever was happening to them? What if she was working with someone to bleed him dry? The idea sounded ridiculous, but paranoia doesn't need logic to take hold. Rebecca, meanwhile, had her own doubts. Daniel was making decisions without consulting her, keeping secrets and shutting her out. She started wondering, was he hiding something? Was he the one behind the missing money? After all, wasn't he the one obsessed with their finances? The trust between them, once unbreakable, was now hanging by a thread. And then, the threats became real. One night, Rebecca was home alone when she heard something outside, a rustling near the back fence. Her heart pounded as she peeked through the curtains. A figure stood there, watching the house. As soon as she saw him, he turned and disappeared into the trees. She called Daniel, her hands shaking, but by the time he got home, there was no sign of anyone. "You're imagining things," he told her, but even as he said it, he wasn't sure he believed it. They both felt it now. They weren't just being harassed. They were being hunted. That same week, Daniel's private investigator finally came back with something. "You need to see this," he said, sliding a folder across the table. Inside were documents, financial records, wire transfers, and confidential information about their accounts that no one outside their inner circle should have had access to. Someone close to them had betrayed them. Someone with access to their money. Someone they trusted. Daniel felt sick as he flipped through the pages. There was a name attached to some of the transactions. Someone they had never suspected. Someone who had been with them from the very beginning. The truth was finally coming out. But so was something else. Something that made Daniel's blood run cold. At the bottom of the last page was a note, handwritten in red ink. You should have never taken that money. And for the first time since all of this started, Daniel realized that this wasn't just about greed, betrayal, or financial theft. This was something much bigger, and it was too late to turn back. Daniel stared at the note in silence, his fingers tightening around the paper as the weight of those words settled into his chest. You should have never taken that money. What did that mean? Had their lottery win not been random? Had someone orchestrated it? And if so, why? Rebecca sat across from him, her hands shaking as she flipped through the documents. Who is this? She asked, pointing at the name attached to the unauthorized transactions. It was Richard Monroe, their financial advisor, the man they had trusted with their wealth since the beginning, the man who had assured them they were safe. The realization hit like a truck. They had been played. Daniel didn't waste time. He called Richard immediately, demanding answers, but the call went straight to voicemail. His hands were slick with sweat as he tried again. Nothing. Rebecca, pacing the room, was already packing a bag. We need to leave, she whispered. But Daniel wasn't ready to run, not yet. He needed to know how deep this went. He needed to know who else was involved. That night, instead of going to a hotel like Rebecca begged him to, he went to Richard's office. It was past midnight, and the building was locked, but Daniel had seen Richard enter his office late at night before. He banged on the door. Open up. Silence. Then, a faint movement behind the blinds. Someone was inside. A moment later, the door unlocked, and Richard stood there, looking pale and exhausted. We need to talk, Daniel growled. Richard let him in, but as soon as the door shut, his expression changed. You need to leave town, he said, his voice eerily calm. Now, Daniel's stomach twisted. What the hell is going on? Richard sighed, rubbing his temples. It wasn't supposed to go this far, he muttered. They were only supposed to scare you. Daniel's blood ran cold. They... Who? Richard shook his head. You don't want to know, but Daniel pressed. And when Richard finally broke, the truth shattered everything Daniel thought he knew. Their lottery win? It wasn't luck. It had been engineered. The numbers they played had been subtly guided into the system by people with powerful connections. People who knew how to manipulate the system just enough without drawing attention. Rebecca and Daniel had been chosen, not because of who they were, but because they fit a certain profile. Middle class, unremarkable, easy to manipulate. They had been given the money, funneled into the game, and watched like lab rats. The only mistake? They weren't supposed to win that much. Someone messed up, Richard admitted, looking genuinely afraid now. And when you started making waves, hiring security, pulling out of deals, questioning things, you became a problem. Daniel felt like the ground had disappeared beneath him. Why us? Richard exhaled, because they needed a face for the story. A relatable couple, a feel-good success. He shook his head. But you weren't supposed to notice. You weren't supposed to start digging. Suddenly, the strange occurrences made sense. The hacked accounts, the missing money, the black SUV. It was all part of a game they hadn't even known they were playing. But what scared Daniel most was the way Richard looked at him, like it was already too late. They're coming for you, Richard whispered. Get out. Daniel didn't need to be told twice. He bolted from the office, his heart hammering as he dialed Rebecca. Pack everything. We're leaving. When he got home, she was already waiting by the door, a duffel bag slung over her shoulder. Where are we going? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel didn't know. All he knew was that they couldn't stay. As they pulled out of the driveway, Rebecca gasped. The black SUV was back, and this time it was following them. Daniel's grip on the steering wheel was so tight his knuckles turned white. The black SUV was following them, its headlights burning into the rearview mirror. Rebecca sat rigid in the passenger seat, her breath shallow, clutching her phone with trembling fingers. "What do we do?" she whispered. Daniel didn't answer. His mind was racing. They couldn't go home. They couldn't go to the police. And they couldn't trust anyone. The SUV picked up speed. It wasn't just following them, it was chasing them. Daniel's pulse spiked as he swerved onto a side road, his tires screeching. He pushed the gas pedal harder, weaving through traffic, hoping to lose them. But the SUV matched every turn, every move. And then the SUV's headlights disappeared. Daniel's heart pounded. Where did they go? He glanced at Rebecca, whose eyes were wide with terror. The road behind them was empty. For a brief moment, relief washed over him. Maybe they had lost them. Maybe... Thud! The entire car jolted as something slammed into them from behind. Daniel's head snapped forward, his vision blurring for a second. The SUV had cut its lights and rammed them from behind. They weren't trying to follow anymore. They were trying to run them off the road. Rebecca screamed as Daniel struggled to keep control of the car. The SUV rammed them again, harder this time, forcing their car toward the guardrail. The tires screeched against the pavement. They were going to die. Daniel made a split-second decision. He yanked the wheel, sending their car skidding onto a dirt path. The SUV tried to follow, but overshot the turn and spun out behind them. For the first time that night, Daniel saw an opening. "Hold on," he shouted, slamming the gas. The car bounced violently over the rough terrain, but they kept going, farther and farther, away from the road, away from the city. They didn't stop until the engine sputtered, the fuel gauge blinking empty. Silence. The night was pitch black, the air thick with the scent of burned rubber and dust. They had ended up in the middle of nowhere. No lights, no people, no sounds except their own ragged breathing. "We can't stay here," Rebecca whispered. They grabbed whatever they could carry and started walking. No destination, no plan, just survival. 3 months later, the world had moved on from the story of Daniel and Rebecca Carter. The news had labeled them as reckless lottery winners who vanished without a trace. Conspiracy theories flooded the internet. Some claimed they faked their disappearance. Others believed they had been kidnapped or murdered. But no one knew the truth. No one knew that Daniel and Rebecca were still alive, living under new identities in a country far from home. They had learned to blend in, to keep their heads down, to never stay in one place for too long. They didn't use banks. They didn't make phone calls. They didn't leave a digital footprint, because somewhere out there, they were still being watched. One evening, as Rebecca walked through a crowded market, she felt it again, that familiar feeling. Someone watching. She turned, heart pounding. A man stood near a fruit stand, pretending to examine an apple. But when their eyes met, he smiled. Rebecca dropped her groceries. She ran, because she knew they had found them again, and this time there would be no escape.